Good morning. Welcome to week 3 of Eco 310. Before we get into the new material, we want to look one more time at the problem of open access that we spoke about during the last session. If you still recall, I had given you the data that speaks about a particular bay with the potential of having any number of boats fishing that particular bay from 1 to 10. And we gave you also the data about the output, the total catch of these fishes, of these boats. If you still recall, and I'll show you the data one more time, but if you still recall, the output has got to increase at a decreasing rate. That is always a given in economics, because we assume also that the costs are going to be increasing at an increasing rate. So in the short run, therefore, the output is going to be increasing at a decreasing rate. We gave you also, if you still recall, the price per pound of fish, and you assume that the market is going to be perfectly competitive, just in order to simplify the calculations. That's to say, irrespective of the number of fish caught, the price is going to be constant all throughout. And I believe we said that it was going to be $2 a pound. Then the only other thing that we had to assume was that we knew what was the total cost of a fishing boat, including obviously building the boat, putting it in the water, and having buying the nets and all what is required in order for it to go out fishing. And we assumed that the cost per boat, again in a perfectly competitive market, is going to be $20. And so the question is, as you might imagine, what is the ideal number of boats? Well, how do we determine the ideal number of boats? Well, our goal, at least in mainstream economics, and we're going to assume this is going to be our goal also in this case, is to try and maximize profits. So what is the most efficient number of boats? It's going to be that number of boats that will maximize profits. Now, we can do the calculations, and we'll go over it right now very rapidly to double check your work, and you'll find out that the ideal number of boats from a purely economic perspective, given the data that I gave you last time, should be only 5 boats. But since we do not have a perfectly competitive market, and since this particular fishing is an open access, we're going to find out that we will overfish. That is to say, there will be 9 boats instead of the 5. And therefore, instead of catching what was the number, I believe 150 tons, 150 pounds, or whatever the unit is going to be, 150 pounds of fish, we're going to wind up really in catching a much smaller, the total catch is going to be exploited. We're going to have a larger number of boats in the market. The ideal way to look at it would be really to go ahead and look at the total catch, and then you will go ahead and look at the total revenue that's going to be generated and the total cost that's going to be generated to find out where is it that the profit is going to be the greatest. And you'll find out that the profit is going to be the greatest at 5 boats. Because at 5 boats, the total profits are going to be at a maximum. While if you go ahead and you look at it from the point of view of not having private property, in the sense that the bay itself is not owned by anyone, so nobody has got to pay anything for the bay. In that case, we will have 9 boats that are going to do the fishing instead of only 5 boats. And so they're going to overfish the market. The market will be overfished by having the 9 boats. It will be abused. The best way to show this is really to look at a diagram. If you look at a diagram, and I would like you to take a quick look at this, you will find out that this is the average revenue. And this will be the marginal revenue. The marginal cost, which is the cost per boat, is going to be constant. Under the conditions of economics, as we had mentioned last time, and as all of you should remember always and forever, whenever you're faced with such a situation in economics, you always equate marginal cost to marginal revenue. Whenever marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, that is the efficient level of production. So marginal cost to marginal revenue are going to really be at the 5 boats. And in this case, what is the total revenue? The total revenue is the area under the marginal revenue curve, the sum of the area under the marginal revenue curve. And this is the cost, the total cost. Therefore, the size of this triangle is going to be what? The total profits. So the total profits would be this. However, since the bay is not owned by anyone, which is true, by the way, of any common, whether it be the oceans or it be the air or it be the water in very many cases, all environmental assets are not owned privately, and therefore they are abused. And this model shows what it is. So if they are going to operate on the basis that it's an open access, then we will operate at the point of marginal cost is equal to average revenue. So what happens at marginal cost is equal to average revenue? We will operate at the point of having 9 boats instead of 5 boats. Which, if you look at it this way, it means that we get rid, all of this would have been profits. Right now, all of this is going to be a loss. So really, we operate until we get rid of all the profits. And this area right now is equal to this area, which means we keep on using more boats until the total profits are 0. And so we're going to have more boats that are going to be fishing the bay in this particular case. And that is used as a general example of what happens whenever there is a common. And all environmental assets, important environmental assets, most environmental assets are commons. That's to say, they are not owned by anyone, therefore they are overused, they are abused, we do not use them efficiently. So if we are to apply economic efficiency, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, we will have 5 boats, but under the conditions of open access, or a common for that matter, we operate where marginal cost is equal to average revenue, and in that case we will be overusing that particular asset. Now, so far as you might have noticed, I hope, what we're really talking about is one of the single most important concepts upon which everything, when it comes to environmental economics, rests. So we're saying there is such a thing as that particular market structure, to go over it very quickly one more time, that always speaks of efficiency. It speaks of the market as being the most efficient allocator of resources. We're all taught that, and the books show it all the time. So how come the environmentalists or the environmental economists are really, or some of the environmental economists, because environmental economists really covers a very wide spectrum. But on the extreme left, let's say the most radical, the ecological economists refuse the basis upon which classical economics is based, and they say, yes, that is true, that it is the most efficient, but it's the most efficient only if the assumptions of having these deep perfect markets exist. But since these deep perfect markets do not exist, then we have always market failures. And whenever there's a market failure, then there's going to be a need for the government. We have given examples of market failure when you have externalities, and these can be corrected through either taxes or subsidies, depending on where they are cost or benefit. But the problem becomes, as you might imagine, in trying to estimate the size of the tax that will bring us back to that perfect equilibrium, to that efficient equilibrium. And the same thing obviously is true of subsidies. But that is a completely different story. But what we must keep in mind is that that idea really was spoken about even by people from the mainstream. But unfortunately, it was not looked upon as being as instrumental as very many of the environmental economists would like us to think. Because they would like us to think, as I suggested last time, that practically every single process of production has a byproduct, and has a byproduct that does not have to be internalized according to the market forces, and so it is treated as an externality. The only way that we can internalize that particular externality is going to be through either passing a tax or government regulation. So in both cases, the market is not capable of correcting that particular failure. The same thing happens whenever you have a public goods. And we are surrounded with public goods. And again, we found out that public goods are always going to be abused because the market cannot price them correctly. And so we operate at that point whereby we are going to be overusing that particular resource. The good example that we spoke about last time, and we're responsible for all the diagrams, would be that of the expansion of a highway. And we find out that in very many cases, expansion of a highway is counterproductive. Under some circumstances, when there is no possibility of offering any inducement to shift the demand, then yes, in that particular case, we'll have no choice but to go ahead and expand. But we're saying in very many cases, we should go ahead and look at demand management, at smart highways, at trying to offer an inducement so that people will change their behavior and use the highway at a different time of the day. Now we're finding out that the same principle also applies when we have an open access. And again, this is very applicable since all environmental assets are really commons. And so whenever there is a common and open, in particular an open access, we're going to run into that question one more time of abuse. Whether it be the air, or whether it be the fishing, or whether it would be the forests, or water tables, or anything that you can think of that is of importance is going to be overused and is going to be abused. So what is it really that we are trying to do? We want to remind ourselves one more time that the model of efficiency that we speak about in economics, we're going to call it static efficiency. So static efficiency, and I want to try and show you this in this particular diagram here, is a diagram and of really nothing else but a supply and demand. Let me see if I can trace it like this. So you have over here a supply and demand. This is the demand curve, and we have over here the supply curve. Now this supply and demand curve, what we teach in economics is that this point of equilibrium is the most efficient. Why is it the most efficient? That is one thing that is unfortunately not stressed often enough in the introductory courses. It is the most efficient because it maximizes consumer surplus and producer surplus. That is to say, what is consumer surplus in this case? Consumer surplus is the sum of all the areas between what the consumers pay and what they would have been willing to pay. What do they pay? The consumers in this case pay this particular price, whatever it is. But each of them would have been willing to pay a higher price. That is the meaning of a demand curve. So if you pay, for example, let's assume that this is 5. If you pay 5 while you are willing to pay 15, it means that you have really gotten 10 for free. So this is the consumer surplus. The second person would have been willing to pay, say, 9, but they pay 5. The third person may be 7, and they pay 5, and so on and so forth. So all of this area, therefore, is an area that the consumers would have been willing to pay, but they get it for free in the market. A very simple example will be, let's assume, the textbooks. If it so happens that your textbook right now is selling for $200, the bookstore is selling each of you the textbook for $200. But those of you who are much more interested in getting an A will be willing to pay maybe $500 to make sure that they have the textbook. Other students aren't willing to pay as much because they'll be satisfied with a B or a C or whatever it is. So the textbook is less valuable to them. So what the bookstore can do is what we're suggesting, is to sell each unit to the highest bidder. So they'll sell the first book to the person who's willing to pay $300, the second book for $150, and so on and so forth. And they will wind up in getting all of this area, therefore, that they would have not gotten before. So this is the consumer surplus, the area that we get for free as a result of the market. So this is one of the simple, most important results of having a market. Now the same thing, by the way, is true for the producers. What does a supply curve mean? A supply curve eventually, and I'm sure that most of you know this, but just as a reminder, is really a cost curve. It means that the producers will be willing to produce something provided that you pay them a particular price. So the producers, therefore, to produce these 10 units, this would be their actual cost, but we're going to pay them a higher price so they will get all of this area for free. This will be their profits. So the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus is going to be this area. Is there any other point over here whereby you can get a greater consumer plus producer surplus? And the answer is no. So static efficiency, i.e. the efficiency of the market, of the intersection of supply and demand, is the most efficient because it always maximizes the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. No other point is going to allow us to get as much of these. If we produce over here, we're going to get a less producer surplus and consumer surplus. And if we're going to produce over here, we're going to get also less because these will be negative. So the only point that maximizes them is this. However, what the environmentalists are saying, this is great if it can be achieved. But this is based on the assumption that we have the deep, perfect markets. And since we don't because of the market failures, then really, in essence, our supply curve is not the same, and therefore we have to interfere in the market in order to bring back this level of efficiency. And the only way that we can interfere will be for the government to go ahead and pass regulations or taxes, or go ahead and sell that particular common. So what is the solution, therefore, for that open access? Really, there are only three measures. In an open access, to get the measures that we are really talking about, we've got to do we have only three options, three scenarios. The government can pass a tax in order to make the cost of fishing, the cost of fishing for that particular boat, more expensive. So if the cost of fishing is going to become more expensive, then there will be less boats. Or they can go ahead and pass a regulation to limit the number of boats, to limit them only to 5 on any kind of basis. They can use lottery, they can use first come, first serve, or they can use any other system that they want. But they will pass a regulation that will limit the number of boats, or they can limit the number of fish that are going to be caught, or the other solution, obviously, is to go ahead and sell the bay to a particular company. Now, don't think of that as being something that doesn't happen. That is actually, it happens quite a lot. What does it mean when we go ahead and we sell the right to go ahead and look for oil or produce oil in a particular field? Instead of making that particular area commons so that every single company can come and buy a couple of acres and look for oil, we go ahead and we sell the right to produce oil from that particular field to only one company. Because we found out when if we're going to have it an open common, then the oil is going to be overused and overexploited, and actually the pressure will be reduced so much that there wouldn't be as much oil coming out. So we've often resorted to this idea of privatizing the common. This poses a problem in the tragedy of the commons, and I don't want to get into it right now because all of you probably have spent some time talking about it, is that how can you be critical of capitalism and yet advocate even more capitalism? The way that one can get around this is by suggesting that this is the best solution. So if capitalism is going to offer me a better solution to, say, private property in this case, rather than to just keep it as a common, then I might as well go ahead and use it. Let me give you just one other example for those of you who are still not who have not bought the idea that that privatizing a common is more productive, is that one of the big droughts that took place in the Sahel in the 1970s, one of the largest actually in sub-Saharan Africa. Some of the airplanes for the UN were flying to try and find out what is it that they can do and to take pictures and photographs of what is going on. And they found a patch of greenery. And when they went down, they found out that that was one of the very few areas that was privately owned. So when it was privately owned, it was not abused. Actually, it was actually quite productive. Why? Because the free ownership took care of it. Because one of the problems that happens whenever you have some of these major catastrophes will be due to the overuse and the abuse of land. When in a common, that's to say, we don't have the institution of private property, everybody feels that they own that particular common, and so that common is always going to be overused and abused. That's to say, if a common, to go back to the example that was used by Garrett Hardin when he popularized the idea, if you have a particular village with a common that can support, let's assume, 100 heads of cattle, but people started bringing in more and more and more heads of cattle, and then all of a sudden you're going to have nothing else but standing room only. So you kill the pasture, which is going to result in less meat and less cattle. That is why it's a tragedy, and it cannot be stopped unless you go ahead and change the whole system upon which the idea is built. And so in that particular case, what is it that you can do? You have to go ahead and privatize it in order for people to operate, therefore, at the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue, instead of saying that marginal cost is going to be equal to average revenue. Now, what I would like to do next is to go ahead and make sure that all of us understand a very important notion which is not in the textbook. So I'm going to leave this until next time because I want to go ahead and devote the full presentation to it. I want to show you that using the traditional technique of supply and demand and maximizing the consumer surplus, because this idea of consumer surplus is going to be used over and over and over again, we will find out that traditional mainstream economics is not capable of guaranteeing sustainability. So what we'll do right now is that we will have to define what is sustainability, and then we'll have to use a number of presentations, graphical presentations, to show that using the traditional technique, as we do the adjustment, we'll find out that sustainability is not guaranteed. Actually, it never really is the outcome. It could be an outcome, but could be the outcome only if we go ahead and interfere with the market. So the market does not guarantee sustainability, which will be another example of saying that really the markets fail, and if sustainability is so important because it really is an existential issue, then we cannot depend only on the market to go ahead and guarantee this sustainability. So we will have to do a full presentation of that using that concept of the consumer surplus. So keep in mind, what does consumer surplus mean? It is the difference between what we pay, that's to say the market price, and what we would have been willing to pay. And this is really the essence of the markets. And in particular, by the way, when producers are not perfectly competitive, producers that are perfectly competitive, they do not make any net economic profits. But those that are not perfectly competitive, they wind up in making a net economic profit. And so whenever you have a company that is making lots of profits, then by definition, you don't have to even really think about it. By definition, that particular field is not perfectly competitive, because a perfectly competitive firm does not make any net economic profit. It makes only market profits, as you say, returns, market returns to all the resources that are being used, which means really, in a sense, that economic profits are equal to zero. And that is a concept that is crucially important for understanding what is meant by perfect competition and by efficiency. Do not forget the definition of efficiency by Pareto. That is again the guiding force of everything in economics. When something is Pareto optimal, which is maximum efficiency, it means that you have arrived at that stage whereby no further changes, no further reallocations are warranted. Because if you can make any reallocation to give Pete without taking away from Paul, then you should do it. But efficiency means that the only way that you can give one is to take away from the other. And that's why static efficiency, as we have seen, is really very simple. It's nothing else but the intersection of supply and demand, because no other point is going to be as efficient. But that the weakness of that is that it assumes that the supply curve is accurate and that the demand curve is accurate. It is easy for us to assume the accuracy of the demand curve, but not the supply, as you can see from what we have spoken about, because of the concept of externalities. So the supply curve usually is completely different. So what appears to be in the marketplace the point of efficiency is probably not that point of is not the true point of efficiency, because we need to go ahead and internalize the externalities. And this is what very many of the environmental measures attempt to do. Let me give you just one example right now before we leave this. Why do you think that we went ahead and we put the catalytic converters on cars? Because prior to the catalytic converters, every single person used to be able to drive his or her car, and they will be emitting all sorts of gases that are going to be that are considered to be negatively affecting the environment. So in order to reduce these, somebody came up with the idea of inventing the catalytic converter that will prevent these gases from being emitted. But who should pay for the catalytic converter? Well, in this case, we're saying the person who is going to be doing the emitting, that's to say the owner of the car, will have to go ahead and install the catalytic converter. So what is the catalytic converter then? The catalytic converter is nothing else but an attempt to internalize an externality. I used to be able to drive my car without having to worry about the emissions, because these emissions were going to be paid for eventually by society. But once I was forced to put a catalytic converter, then I had to go ahead and pay an additional $1,500 for the privilege of owning a car or driving a car, or in order to at least reduce some of these particular emissions. The same thing is true, by the way, when we moved from using styrofoam cups of coffee to non-styrofoam cups of coffee. That was really an attempt to try and internalize an externality. Because the styrofoam cups, although they were less expensive to produce, they were the ones whereby we were not paying the cost of cleaning up the mess that they create. Because we found out that some of them will be able to survive for centuries. And so therefore we were really getting away with an externality. We were creating an externality that we were not paying for. When we dump things into the river, it's the same thing. If we change the oil in our car and we dump it instead of taking it to be recycled, again we're going to be affecting the water table, and we're going to be affecting the sewer systems and what have you. So we will be then not doing nothing else but externalities. The idea behind taxing cigarettes. I mean, I remember when cigarettes used to be 35 cents a pack. Right now, at least in the New York area, they're around $11. The price of producing the cigarette has not increased that much. Most of that is really nothing else but a tax. So why is that tax? It is really to try and internalize the externality of smoking. Secondhand smoke, it isn't only that you're hurting yourself, but society is the one that has got to pick up the tab in order to take care of you and of the damage that is being caused by secondhand smoke. The same idea, by the way, is true if you happen to ride a motorcycle. Why is it that you have to wear a helmet? Some people will argue, well, I'm free really to commit suicide. Well, that's true, you're free to commit suicide if you want to. But once an accident happens, who is it that's going to pick up the tab? Well, it's going to be society. Society, therefore, tries to internalize that particular cost, or at least a portion of that cost, by forcing you to go ahead and wear a helmet. Now, mainstream economics does not like the fact that the only way to go ahead and solve these issues of market failure is to go ahead and regulate, is for government to interfere. And as some of you have found out, mainstream economics came up with a solution. And that solution is very well known as being the Coase theorem. So Coase is the person who came up with the suggestion that we can rehabilitate all of mainstream economics. There is no need for us to go ahead and interfere with the market. The market can correct itself and can go back to the point of efficiency by itself without any government interference. Coase was not an economist per se. He was really much more of a lawyer at the University of Chicago, and he won a Nobel Prize of Economics for his contribution to this field. He really never understood the total fuss that everybody made as based on that the few articles that he wrote on this particular subject, because he said, all what I'm doing is that I am really reinterpreting Smith. So he said, essentially, the Coase theorem is that if we have property rights that are very well defined, and if there is no cost associated with a particular transaction, then the parties in that particular field will always by themselves be able to come to equilibrium that is going to be efficient without the need for any government interference. And that has become the basis of most of the environmental policies, not only in the United States, but the world over. Obviously, the shortcoming of this is that even the ideas that Coase was talking about really are not found in the real world. So we try to modify the world, but there is still a need for the government to interfere, but not as big of a need as it used to be. By creating the institutions of private property that are very well defined. Now, what does a well-defined institution of private property means? Especially when you think of some of the examples that we have given, is that there won't be any longer any open access. Because every single asset will have a very well-defined private property. And so nobody will be able to take advantage of any other person. And externalities will no longer be as big of a problem. The issue is that we do not have well-defined private properties. Actually, in very many parts of the world, even what we take for granted in the United States as being private property really does not exist. Actually, very many mainstream economists have argued that one of the problems of third world countries, of underdeveloped nations, of developing countries, what we call developing countries these days, is the fact that they do not have well-defined property rights. In very many cases, they just don't have any property right. That's to say, you have some people in certain countries that have been farming a particular piece of land for decades, and yet they do not have a deed to that particular plot of land. Now, why is it important to have a deed? Well, an American farmer, in order to buy a new tractor, will go ahead and will get a loan from a bank. If you are in one of these countries whereby you do not have a deed to the land, how would you be able to go ahead and borrow the money in order to buy the tractor? You will not. And so your method of production, therefore, is not going to be up to snuff. So the idea of having very well-defined property rights is essential at all levels, but in particular at the level of environmental assets, which means that we've got to create property rights even for environmental assets, for the right to pollute. So what have we done as a result of Coase? All of these things are as a result of Coase. We went ahead and we created the options whereby we sell the right to produce, the right to go ahead and pollute. So the options of having the right to produce, say, CO2 or SO2, you create a property, therefore we had to create a market for it. A market that doesn't exist, a fictitious market. And that's why we go ahead and we start selling the options. It's an options market. I mean, I happen to own a number of these small options, whereby I own the right to go ahead and produce, let's assume, 1 ton of SO2 in the Adirondacks. But when I bought that right for, $25 or $20, I didn't exercise it. So I took it out of the market so that the big companies will not be able to go ahead and buy that particular right. So the government, again, indirectly has a role to play. And what else is there that is really a weakness about Coase? Is that there is no such thing as a transaction that is free, in particular when it involves a very large number of actors. There is no doubt that you and I can arrange to have a transaction that doesn't cost us anything over a cup of coffee by talking to each other or something like that. But what if we're going to have, let's assume, 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people? we wouldn't have a room that's large enough in order to have all of these people. And the cost of the transaction is going to become extremely high. So COSE is really, in essence, nothing else but the idea that if we can create, and normally we can't, but if we can create an environment whereby there is no cost to the transaction, and whereby we have perfectly defined property rights, and we'll do certain examples later on, then in that case, the market will restore efficiency irrespective of who is it that is doing the polluting. There is no need in that particular model for taxes or regulation. So in theory, it is doable. In practice, that is a completely different story. So let us right now leave it at this point, so that next time I will talk maybe a little bit more about COSE, give you one numerical example about COSE, at least in theory, how is it that it can work, and do a full model, graphical model using also numbers about what is it that we mean by when we say that sustainability is not guaranteed by mainstream economics. But that, let me warn you from right now, the models aren't difficult, but you are going to be responsible for reproducing them in the same way that you are responsible for reproducing all the models that we have spoken about so far. Okay? So I will talk to you later on about this issue of sustainability, and one example about COSE.